Today, there are over 8 billion humans living on Earth. We're everywhere. Cities, farms, mountains, deserts, even Antarctica. We've built skyscrapers that pierce the clouds, sent robots to Mars, created technologies that connect every corner of the planet. We dominate this world like no species ever has. But here's the weird part. We shouldn't. Think about it. Compared to other great apes, humans are pathetic. A chimpanzee can tear your arm off without breaking a sweat. They're about 5 times stronger than us pound for pound. Gorillas? Forget about it. A silverback could literally rip you in half. Even orangutans, who spend most of their time just chilling in trees, could beat any human in a straight fight. We can't run as fast as most predators. We don't have claws, fangs, or armor. Our sense of smell is terrible. Our hearing is mediocre. We can't see in the dark. Put a naked human in the African savannah next to a lion, a hyena, even a baboon, and the smart money isn't on the human. Yet somehow, we won. We didn't just survive. We conquered. Every other species on this planet exists either because we allow it, or because we haven't gotten around to dealing with it yet. How did that happen? If you're using this to fall asleep, that's literally why I make these. So subscribe maybe, and tell me where you are and what time it is. I check comments, and it's like, Tokyo at lunch, Toronto at midnight, all at once. Seriously, drop a comment. I want to know where this story is travelling to reach you. Now let's go back, way back, 300,000 years ago, East Africa, the Great Rift Valley. The world looks different. No cities, no farms, no roads, just endless grassland stretching to the horizon, broken up by patches of forest, winding rivers, and volcanic mountains smoking in the distance. And somewhere in that landscape, a small band of creatures is trying very hard not to die. They're us, sort of. Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans. If you saw one walking down the street today, you probably wouldn't look twice. Same body structure, same brain size, same basic features. But they're not living like modern humans. They're living like every other animal. Hand to mouth, day to day. Hunting small game, gathering plants, avoiding predators, trying to find water, trying to stay alive. They're not special, not yet. They're just one species among many. Homo erectus is still around, spread across Africa and Asia. Neanderthals are thriving in Europe. Denisovans are somewhere in Asia, though we won't discover them until we find their DNA in a cave 300,000 years later. There are probably other human species we don't even know about yet, because they'll go extinct without leaving enough fossils for us to find. In this world, Homo sapiens is nobody. Just another primate trying to make it through another day. If you could see the future, if you could see what this species would become, you wouldn't believe it. You'd laugh. These fragile, slow, weak creatures are going to take over the entire planet. They're going to outlast every other human species. They're going to build Rome and Beijing and New York. They're going to split the atom and walk on the moon. Impossible. Except it happened. And the question that keeps scientists up at night is simple. Why? What did we have that nobody else did? What single advantage was so powerful that it took us from struggling to survive in one corner of Africa to dominating every continent on Earth? Here's where it gets interesting. The answer isn't what you think. It's not our brains. Neanderthals had bigger brains than us. It's not our tools. Other species made tools. Homo erectus used hand axes for nearly 2 million years. It's not even our ability to walk upright. Every human species could do that. The answer is something stranger, something more subtle, something that doesn't leave fossils or artifacts or obvious traces in the archaeological record. And that's exactly what makes it so hard to study. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can understand why Homo sapiens succeeded, we need to understand what we were up against. because the journey from the African plains to global dominance wasn't smooth. It wasn't inevitable. There were moments when it almost didn't happen at all. Moments when our entire species teetered on the edge of extinction. When we were reduced to numbers so small that mathematically we shouldn't have survived. When the future of humanity hung by a thread so thin that one bad drought, one disease, one unlucky generation could have snuffed us out forever. But we made it. Against odds that still make scientists shake their heads in disbelief. And somewhere along that desperate journey, something changed. Something clicked. A switch flipped in the human mind that turned us from just another struggling species into something the world had never seen before. This is the story of that transformation, of how the weakest great ape became the most dominant species on the planet, of how we went from barely surviving to reshaping the entire world in our image, of how humans rose above all species, and fair warning, the answer might make you see yourself, your mind, your entire civilization differently. Because what made us special wasn't something we found or something we built. It was something we learned to do with the 3 pounds of meat inside our skulls. Something that seems simple until you realize no other species has ever figured it out the way we did. So get comfortable. Settle in. Let's start at the beginning, back when humans were nothing special, and trace the journey that led us here, to this moment. Where you're listening to these words, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is for you, connected to billions of other humans through technologies that would look like magic to our ancestors. The story of how we got here is stranger than you think. Around 70,000 years ago, something extraordinary happened inside the human skull, something that had never occurred in 4 billion years of life on Earth. A neurological revolution that would separate us not just from other animals, but from every other human species that had ever existed. The human brain started rewiring itself. Now, this wasn't a sudden mutation. No single gene flipped on to make us suddenly smarter. Instead, it was the culmination of hundreds of thousands of years of evolutionary pressure that had started during the bottleneck. All that selection for problem solving, for social cooperation, for rapid adaptation to changing environments. It had been building toward a threshold, and around 70,000 years ago, our ancestors crossed it. Anthropologists call this the cognitive revolution, and it changed everything. The physical evidence is subtle. If you compare a modern human skull from 100,000 years ago to one from 50,000 years ago, they look remarkably similar. The brain case is about the same size. The bone structure is nearly identical. But something fundamental had shifted inside that skull. The software had upgraded even though the hardware looked the same. The first clue comes from the archaeological record. Before 70,000 years ago, human technology changes slowly. Stone tools evolve gradually, over tens of thousands of years. Each generation makes essentially the same hand axes and scrapers their grandparents made. Innovation happens, but it crawls forward at a geological pace. Then suddenly, explosively, everything accelerates. After 70,000 years ago, new tool types appear every few thousand years instead of every few 100,000. We see specialized implements designed for specific tasks. Bone needles for sewing, fish hooks and harpoons for aquatic hunting, spear throwers that multiply the force of human arms, complex composite tools made from multiple, carefully prepared materials. But tools are just the visible tip of a much deeper transformation. The real revolution was happening in how humans thought about the world. For the first time in history, humans began creating art. Not accidental marks or random scratches, but intentional symbolic representations. Cave painting showing animals in motion, human handprints stenciled on rock walls, carved figurines depicting animals and humans. The oldest confirmed art dates to around 40,000 years ago, but there's evidence it started earlier, perhaps much earlier in Africa, where preservation conditions are less favourable. This artistic explosion represents something profound. To create art, you need to think symbolically. You need to understand that a drawing of a bison isn't actually a bison, but represents one. You need to conceive of the abstract idea of representation itself. That requires a level of cognitive sophistication that no other species has ever achieved. Along with art came ritual. Burial practices become increasingly elaborate after 70,000 years ago. Not just placing bodies in the ground like Neanderthals had done, but decorating them with ochre pigments, including grave goods, positioning bodies in specific orientations. These practices suggest our ancestors had developed complex beliefs about death, the afterlife, perhaps the existence of souls or spirits. They were thinking about things that didn't physically exist. They were imagining realities beyond the immediately observable world. But the most important cognitive revolution was happening in the realm of language. Humans had been communicating for hundreds of thousands of years, but the sophistication of that communication had been limited, probably similar to what we see in other intelligent social animals. Warnings about predators, calls indicating food sources, signals coordinating group activities. After the cognitive revolution, human language became something entirely different. It became capable of discussing things that didn't exist at all. Think about what that means. Other animals can communicate about present realities. A vervet monkey can make different alarm calls for eagles versus leopards. A bee can dance to indicate the direction and distance to flowers. But no other species can talk about things that aren't there. After the cognitive revolution, humans could describe animals they'd never seen, places they'd never been, events that hadn't happened yet. More importantly, they could discuss things that existed only in imagination. Gods and spirits, tribes and nations, laws and justice, abstract concepts with no physical form. This ability, what cognitive scientists call full modern language, gave humans a staggering advantage. They could share information with incredible precision. Not just, there are buffalo near the river, but 3 days north, past the rocky outcrop that looks like a bear's head, there's a valley where buffalo gather every summer when the purple flowers bloom. That level of detailed information transfer meant knowledge could accumulate across generations instead of dying with each individual. A hunter could describe a complex technique he'd discovered. Others could learn it, refine it, teach their improved version to their children. Innovation could compound over time. Even more importantly, abstract language allowed humans to coordinate in entirely new ways. Before the cognitive revolution, human social groups were limited by the same constraints that limit other primates. You can only maintain close personal relationships with about 150 individuals. This isn't arbitrary. It's hardwired into primate social cognition. You physically cannot track the complex social relationships, hierarchies, and obligations of more than about 150 people. This is called Dunbar's number, and it represents a hard ceiling on group size for species that maintain social cohesion through personal relationships alone. But abstract language offered a way around this limitation. For the first time, humans could cooperate with strangers, not because they personally knew them, not because they were related by blood, but because they believed in the same shared fictions. A tribe of 500 people could function as a cohesive unit if they all believed they descended from the same legendary ancestor. An army of 10,000 could fight together if they all worshipped the same gods. A trading network could span a continent if everyone accepted that certain shells or stones had value as currency. None of this was real in the physical sense. There was no actual ancestral spirit watching over the tribe. The gods existed only in collective imagination. The shells had no practical use beyond decoration. But because everyone believed in these shared fictions, they became functionally real. They created social realities that enabled unprecedented levels of cooperation. This was revolutionary. Other human species like Neanderthals could cooperate in small groups. They hunted together, shared food, cared for their sick. But their cooperation was limited to people they knew personally. They couldn't scale up beyond the immediate band. Modern humans, after the cognitive revolution, could organize hundreds or thousands of people toward common goals. They could form tribes that controlled vast territories. They could establish trade networks connecting dozens of separate groups. They could mobilize large numbers of people for big game hunts, territorial conflicts, or massive construction projects. And they could do all this without any physical changes to their bodies. No stronger muscles, no sharper teeth, no thicker hides, just better software running in their heads. The neurological basis for all this remains somewhat mysterious. We know the brain didn't suddenly grow larger. Instead, something changed about how existing neural structures were organized and connected. One theory focuses on what neuroscientists call neural reuse. The human brain is built from ancient components that evolved for basic survival functions: vision processing, motor control, social recognition, threat assessment. But after the cognitive revolution, these specialized modules became increasingly interconnected. Brain regions that originally evolved for navigation started contributing to abstract reasoning about time. Neural circuits for recognizing faces began processing symbolic representations. Motor control systems that coordinated physical movements were recruited for manipulating abstract concepts. It's like taking a collection of specialized tools and suddenly discovering you can combine them in new ways to do things none of them were originally designed for. The hardware hadn't changed, but the connections between components had become vastly more sophisticated. Another key development was what psychologists call mental time travel. The ability to consciously project yourself into past or future scenarios and imagine what it would be like. All animals react to their environment. Many can learn from experience. Some can even plan, ahead in limited ways. A squirrel buries nuts for winter. A lion waits in ambush for prey. But this is largely instinctual or based on immediate circumstances. After the cognitive revolution, humans could mentally simulate scenarios that had never happened. A hunter could lie awake imagining different ways an upcoming hunt might unfold, planning responses to problems that didn't exist yet. A mother could recall her own childhood experiences and apply those lessons to raising her children. An elder could recount events from decades earlier, passing knowledge across generations. This capacity for mental time travel meant humans could learn from experiences they hadn't personally had. They could anticipate problems before encountering them. They could refine strategies through pure thought, rather than dangerous trial and error. Combined with sophisticated language, this created an exponential knowledge accumulation system. Every generation could start from where the previous generation left off, building on accumulated knowledge rather than rediscovering everything from scratch. The effects were dramatic. Tool technology that had evolved slowly for hundreds of thousands of years suddenly began accelerating. Within 30,000 years after the cognitive revolution began, humans had developed countless specialized implements, each designed for specific tasks. But more importantly, they developed the ability to innovate situationally. When humans encountered a new environment, they didn't need to wait for biological evolution to adapt them. They could imagine solutions, discuss possibilities, experiment with new approaches. Within a few generations, they could develop technologies and techniques perfectly suited to local conditions. This cognitive flexibility was the ultimate survival advantage. When climate shifted, humans could shift their strategies just as quickly. When prey populations changed, They could switch hunting methods. When they encountered unfamiliar environments, they could innovate solutions on the fly. Neanderthals, who had perfected survival strategies through hundreds of thousands of years of biological adaptation, couldn't compete with this kind of mental agility. They were locked into successful but rigid approaches. When conditions changed, they struggled to adapt quickly enough. Modern humans could reinvent themselves every few generations if needed. The cognitive revolution also transformed human social organization in subtle but crucial ways. With the ability to believe in shared myths and abstract concepts, humans could maintain much larger and more complex social structures. Leaders could claim authority not just through physical dominance, but through connection to imagined powers. Shamans who could communicate with spirits, chiefs descended from legendary heroes, priests who interpreted the will of gods. These social roles, based entirely on collective belief, created stable hierarchies that could organize large groups effectively. Humans also developed increasingly sophisticated kinship systems, not just recognizing close relatives, but maintaining awareness of complex family relationships across multiple generations. Knowing your second cousins, your wife's sister's husband's family, your great-grandmother's lineage. This intricate web of recognized relationships created social networks that could span vast distances. When a band of 30 people encountered another group 200 miles away, they might discover they shared distant relatives. That connection, mediated by abstract concepts of family and kinship, could transform potential enemies into trading partners or allies. Art and ritual played crucial roles in maintaining these extended social networks. Shared artistic traditions created group identity. Everyone who painted in a certain style or used specific symbols belonged to the same cultural community. Shared rituals, ceremonies, and celebrations reinforced collective beliefs and strengthened social bonds. A group that gathered every summer for a ritual hunt wasn't just obtaining food. They were maintaining relationships, reinforcing shared stories, teaching the next generation their cultural traditions. The ritual itself was a form of social technology, keeping the community connected across time and distance. This cultural transmission of knowledge became just as important as genetic inheritance, maybe more important. A child born to the best hunters in the tribe would still need to learn hunting techniques through teaching and practice. The skills weren't inherited. They were culturally transmitted through language, demonstration, and shared experience. This meant human populations could accumulate useful knowledge far faster than biological evolution alone would allow. A clever individual could discover a better way to prepare animal hides. She could teach this technique to others. Within a generation, the entire community would be using the improved method. Within a few generations, the technique might spread across hundreds of miles as groups encountered each other and shared knowledge. The pace of innovation accelerated exponentially. Each generation inherited not just genes from their ancestors, but also accumulated knowledge, refined techniques, improved technologies. The gap between humans and other species widened with every passing millennium. By 30,000 years ago, the effects of the cognitive revolution were undeniable. Modern humans had spread across the entire old world, adapting to environments from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest to arid desert. They had developed hundreds of distinct cultures, each with its own language, art, traditions, and technologies. They had domesticated dogs, created musical instruments, developed elaborate burial practices and religious rituals. They had become something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. A species whose primary adaptation wasn't physical but mental, whose survival depended not on strength or speed, but on the ability to imagine, communicate, cooperate, and innovate. The cognitive revolution had taken the genetic legacy of the bottleneck, that refined capacity for problem-solving and social cooperation, and amplified it beyond anything natural selection alone could have achieved. The hardware that had been optimized during those desperate 117,000 years of near extinction had developed software that could remake the world. But this was just the beginning. The cognitive tools that had emerged between 70,000 and 30,000 years ago would become the foundation for everything that followed: agriculture, cities, writing, science, technology. Every achievement of human civilization would ultimately trace back to the neural rewiring that happened during those crucial millennia. When minds became our greatest weapon, we stopped being just another species struggling to survive. We became architects of our own destiny, and nothing on Earth would ever be the same. But survival wasn't just about having the right genes or being smart enough to outlast a climate crisis. Intelligence means nothing if you freeze to death in the night or starve because you can't access the food around you. What really set our ancestors apart wasn't just their ability to think, it was their ability to transform thought into action, to take the hostile world around them and bend it to their will. And that transformation began with the most revolutionary technology in human history: fire. Now we tend to take fire for granted today. Flip a switch, turn a dial, instant heat and light. But for our ancestors, controlling fire wasn't just convenient. It was the difference between expansion and extinction. The earliest evidence of controlled fire use dates back roughly 1.5 million years, long before modern humans existed. But there's a crucial difference between using fire and controlling it. Early hominins probably scavenged fire from natural sources: lightning strikes, volcanic activity, spontaneous combustion in dry vegetation. They could keep flames alive for a while, maybe transport burning branches from one camp to another, but they couldn't create it on demand. The real breakthrough came later, probably around 400,000 years ago, when human ancestors figured out how to make fire themselves, striking stones together to create sparks, using friction to generate heat in carefully prepared wood. These techniques sound simple, but they represent an enormous cognitive leap. You have to understand abstract concepts like combustion and heat transfer. You need to plan ahead, gathering the right materials and preparing them properly. You have to practice the techniques hundreds of times before they become reliable. But once they mastered fire creation, everything changed. Suddenly humans weren't dependent on finding natural fire sources. They could create warmth whenever they needed it. They could move into colder regions that had been off limits to their ancestors. They could survive through harsh winters that would have killed earlier hominin populations. Fire gave them independence from climate in a way no other species had ever achieved. But warmth was just the beginning. Cooking might have been even more important. Raw food requires massive amounts of energy to digest. Your stomach and intestines have to work for hours breaking down tough plant fibers and raw meat. Cooked food is different. Heat does much of the digestive work externally, breaking down complex molecules, killing parasites, making nutrients more accessible. A cooked meal delivers far more usable calories than the same food eaten raw. This had profound effects on human evolution. With cooking, our ancestors could extract more energy from less food. They needed smaller digestive systems. All that biological energy that had been dedicated to digestion could be redirected elsewhere. Like to our brains, which are incredibly energy-hungry organs. Some researchers think the control of fire and the adoption of cooking created a feedback loop that accelerated brain evolution. Better cooking techniques meant more available calories. More calories meant larger brains could be supported. Larger brains meant more sophisticated cooking methods could be invented. And around it went, each innovation building on the last. Fire also transformed social life. A campfire is a gathering place. It provides light that extends the day, allowing humans to remain active after sunset. You can sit around fire, working on tools, telling stories, planning tomorrow's hunt. Archaeological sites from 300,000 years ago show distinctive patterns. Central hearths surrounded by worked stone, suggesting our ancestors were already using firelight for evening tool production and social interaction. This might have been where complex language really took off. Sitting around a fire in the darkness, early humans had the time and the secure setting to develop sophisticated communication. They could teach young people complex skills. They could share information about distant places. They could develop the rich oral traditions that would eventually become the foundation of human culture. Fire also offered protection. Predators fear flames. A well-maintained fire could keep dangerous animals at bay during vulnerable nighttime hours. This meant humans could sleep more soundly, could venture into territories that would otherwise be too dangerous, could establish camps in locations that offered strategic advantages rather than just defensive security. But perhaps most importantly, fire was a tool that created other tools. You could use fire to harden wooden spears, transforming soft wood into rock-hard points. You could use heat to make stone tools easier to work, fracturing brittle materials more precisely. Later, much later, fire would become the foundation of metallurgy, pottery, and countless other technologies. But even in its earliest applications, fire was a force multiplier that made every other tool more effective, and those other tools were evolving rapidly. The stone implements that had dominated human technology for millions of years were becoming increasingly sophisticated. Early tools were simple. Take a rock, hit it with another rock until you get a sharp edge. Use that edge to cut or scrape. These Oldowan tools, named after Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania where they were first identified, served human ancestors for nearly 2 million years. They worked well enough for basic tasks, butchering scavenged carcasses, processing plant foods, working wood. But around 1.7 million years ago, someone figured out how to make something better. Acheulean hand axes appeared, carefully crafted teardrop-shaped tools with sharp edges all around. These required much more skill to produce. You had to visualize the final form before you started working. You needed to strike the stone at precise angles, removing flakes systematically to create a symmetrical, balanced tool. This was manufacturing in the truest sense, not just random modification, but planned production of a specific design. For over 1 million years, hand axes remained the cutting edge of human technology. Then, starting around 300,000 years ago, toolmaking accelerated dramatically. Prepared core techniques emerged, where toolmakers would carefully shape a stone core so they could strike off multiple identical flakes, each one a usable tool. This is standardization. Industrial thinking. One piece of raw material producing numerous finished products according to a predetermined design. By 70,000 years ago, modern humans in Africa were creating composite tools, not just single pieces of worked stone, but sophisticated implements made from multiple materials. Spear points carefully shaped and then attached to wooden shafts with plant resin adhesives. Handles wrapped with leather strips for better grip. Cutting tools with backing along one edge to protect the user's hand. Each of these innovations represents layers of abstract thinking. You have to understand material properties. You need to recognize that different substances can be combined for enhanced performance. You must plan ahead, gathering multiple components before beginning assembly. The sophistication continued escalating. Microliths appeared, tiny stone blades that could be combined to create complex cutting edges. Imagine a knife with a serrated edge, but each tooth is a separate, carefully shaped piece of stone set into a groove. This technology allowed humans to create extremely effective cutting tools from small amounts of raw material. In regions where good toolstone was scarce, this efficiency was critical. But stone wasn't the only material humans mastered. bone and ivory tools emerged, shaped through grinding and carving rather than flaking. These materials could be worked into forms impossible with stone. Needles with eyes for threading sinew, allowing the creation of fitted clothing. Fishhooks curved and barbed to secure catches. Harpoon points with backward-facing barbs that prevented prey from escaping. Each new tool opened new possibilities. Spear throwers, essentially lever systems that multiplied the force of a human arm, allowed hunters to launch projectiles with deadly accuracy from safe distances. Archaeological experiments show that a skilled user with a spear thrower could kill a large animal from 30 meters away. This transformed hunting from a dangerous close-quarter struggle to a strategic activity where humans could engage prey on their own terms. Nets and traps appear in the archaeological record around 40,000 years ago. These represent another cognitive leap. You're not just responding to prey when you encounter it. You're setting up systems that work even when you're not present. You're thinking about animal behavior patterns, predicting where they'll go and what they'll do. You're engineering solutions to hunting problems. But tools weren't just about acquiring food. They were also about surviving in environments that should have been completely off-limits to a tropical African species. Clothing technology might not sound as dramatic as fire or weapons, but it was just as revolutionary. Early humans were hairless compared to other primates. This was probably an adaptation to heat stress in tropical Africa, allowing more efficient cooling through sweating. But hairlessness becomes a serious liability in cold climates. The solution was artificial covering. Animal skins could provide insulation, but raw hides are stiff and uncomfortable. Someone figured out how to scrape hides clean, probably using specialized stone scrapers. Someone learned that certain plant materials could tan leather, making it soft and flexible. Someone invented the bone needle, allowing skins to be sewn into fitted garments that stayed in place and provided effective insulation. These might seem like simple innovations, but they required extensive knowledge of materials and processes. You need to know which animals provide the best hides. You have to understand that fresh hides will rot unless treated. You must discover, probably through extensive trial and error, which plant substances make good tanning agents. You need to develop the motor skills to create tiny, precisely formed needles from brittle bone material. With clothing technology mastered, humans could survive in Siberia, in northern Europe during ice ages, in high mountain environments where nighttime temperatures plunged below freezing even in summer. They weren't limited to tropical and subtropical zones anymore. They could go anywhere. Shelter technology followed similar patterns of increasing sophistication. Early humans used natural shelters, caves, rock overhangs, anywhere that provided basic protection from weather. But natural shelters limit where you can go. If there are no caves in a region, you can't establish a permanent presence. The solution was to create artificial shelters. The earliest were probably simple windbreaks, branches and hides arranged to block prevailing winds. Then came more substantial structures. Archaeological sites from 400,000 years ago show evidence of constructed shelters. Circles of stones that probably held down hide coverings. Post holes indicating wooden frameworks. By 25,000 years ago, humans in Ice Age Europe were building elaborate houses from mammoth bones, using massive skulls and tusks as structural elements, covering them with hides to create substantial dwellings that could house extended families through brutal winters. These weren't temporary camps. They were permanent or semi-permanent settlements. This represents another fundamental shift in human ecology. Most predators are nomadic, following prey animals across seasonal ranges. Humans were beginning to establish territories, building infrastructure that would last for years or even decades. This required entirely new ways of thinking about resources and planning. Which brings us to hunting strategies themselves. Early hominins were probably scavengers more than hunters, driving other predators from kills, processing abandoned carcasses. But as tools and social organization improved, humans became active predators. Not just opportunistic ones, but systematic, strategic hunters who could take down the largest and most dangerous prey animals. The archaeological record shows increasingly sophisticated hunting techniques. Drive lines appear in many locations, rows of stones or posts that create funnels, channeling prey animals toward kill zones. Some sites show evidence of cliff drives, where herds of animals were stampeded over precipices, providing massive amounts of meat in a single coordinated hunt. These techniques require detailed knowledge of animal behavior. You have to know migration routes and seasonal patterns. You need to understand how different species react to pressure, which directions they'll run when frightened. You must coordinate dozens of people in precisely timed movements. This is complex project management requiring planning, communication, and flawless execution. But the really remarkable thing is that humans learned the specific behaviors of dozens of different prey species. Mammoth hunting required different strategies than bison. Reindeer behaved differently than horses. Successful hunters had to be behavioral ecologists, maintaining detailed mental maps of how different animals would respond to different circumstances in different seasons. This knowledge was hard-won, accumulated over thousands of generations, and it had to be transmitted accurately from experienced hunters to novices. You couldn't learn mammoth hunting through trial and error. One mistake and you or your hunting partners could be killed. This created intense selection pressure for effective teaching methods and learning abilities. The hunters who could communicate complex information clearly and the students who could absorb and retain detailed technical knowledge were the ones who survived to pass on their genes. Water became another frontier to master. Early humans were terrestrial, confined to land, but coastal regions and waterways offered rich resources if you could access them. Shellfish beds that could provide reliable protein, fish populations that migrated predictably, islands that offered untouched resources for anyone capable of reaching them. By 50,000 years ago, humans had developed watercraft. We don't know exactly what the first boats looked like because wood rarely survives in the archaeological record, but we know they existed because humans reached islands in Southeast Asia that were never connected to the mainland, even during Ice Age low sea levels. Someone built boats capable of crossing 50 kilometers of open ocean. Someone developed navigation skills, allowing them to find small islands in vast seascapes. This represents yet another domain mastered, not just land environments, but aquatic ones. Not just walking distance, but anywhere a boat could reach. Archaeological sites from coastal regions show fishhooks, net weights, and the remains of deep-water fish species. Humans had become competent maritime hunters, adding entire ecosystems to their resource base. But perhaps the most important mastery was yet to come. All of these technologies, fire, tools, clothing, shelter, systematic hunting, water navigation, these allowed humans to extract resources from their environment more effectively than any other species. But they were still fundamentally dependent on what nature provided. If the herds didn't migrate through your territory, you went hungry. If the plant foods failed, you starved. Humans were supremely effective hunter-gatherers, but they were still at nature's mercy. Then, around 12,000 years ago, everything changed again. Someone noticed that if you scattered seeds in suitable soil, plants would grow. This seems obvious now, but it was a revolutionary observation. You didn't have to wander searching for wild foods. You could create food where you wanted it. Someone noticed that certain animals could be tamed, that young wild sheep or goats raised among humans would become docile, easier to manage than wild populations. These observations led to the Neolithic Revolution, the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture and animal husbandry. It didn't happen overnight. It took thousands of years of experimentation, selective breeding, and technological development. But once it started, it was irreversible. Agriculture meant humans could support much larger populations in smaller territories. A hunter-gatherer band might need hundreds of square kilometers to sustain 50 people. The same land under cultivation could feed thousands. This population density made possible entirely new forms of social organization. Villages, then towns, then cities. Specialized labor where not everyone had to focus on food production. Artisans, traders, administrators, warriors, priests. But agriculture also meant something more profound. It meant humans were no longer adapting to their environment. They were adapting the environment to themselves. Instead of moving to where food was available, they were making food available where they wanted to live. They were breaking free from the ecological constraints that limited every other species. Of course, this control came with costs. Agricultural populations were more vulnerable to crop failures. They were more susceptible to diseases that spread through dense settlements. They created social inequalities, as some individuals controlled more resources than others. But they were also more resilient in crucial ways. A hunter-gatherer band that suffered losses might take generations to recover. An agricultural society could absorb massive population losses and bounce back within years. By 10,000 years ago, humans had domesticated wheat, barley, rice, corn, depending on the region. They had tamed sheep, goats, cattle, pigs, chickens, horses. They had developed irrigation systems to water crops, storage technologies to preserve harvests, and pottery for cooking and storing food. They had created permanent settlements with substantial architecture. They had developed writing systems to record information, moving beyond pure oral tradition. The species that had once numbered only 1,280 individuals, barely clinging to existence, had become the dominant force on the planet. And it all came down to this progressive mastery of fire, tools, and environment. Each innovation built on previous ones. Fire made better tools possible. Better tools enabled more effective hunting. Effective hunting supported larger populations. Larger populations could sustain more specialists who could develop even better technologies. It was a feedback loop that accelerated over time. The first stone tools took millions of years to develop. The transition from simple to complex tools took hundreds of thousands. The jump to agriculture happened in mere thousands, and once it began, technological change accelerated even faster. But here's what's really remarkable. None of these innovations required biological evolution. Humans didn't develop new genes for firemaking or boat building or agriculture. The same basic cognitive toolkit that had been refined during the bottleneck could learn any of these skills. What changed wasn't human biology, it was human culture, the accumulated knowledge passed down through generations, building layer upon layer. This was the ultimate environmental mastery, not just adapting to whatever nature provided, but creating the environment you wanted. Not just reacting to challenges, but anticipating and preventing them. Not just surviving, but thriving in any conditions Earth could throw at you. And it freed humans from the constraints that limited every other species. Other animals were trapped by their evolutionary histories. Polar bears could survive in the Arctic, but not in the tropics. Camels could handle deserts, but not rainforests. But humans with their tools, their fire, their shelters, their clothing could go anywhere. Arctic tundra, tropical rainforest, high mountains, arid deserts. It didn't matter. They could master it all. This is why Homo sapiens survived when Neanderthals and Denisovans didn't. Not because we were physically superior, we weren't. Not because we were individually smarter, we probably weren't. But because we had developed the most effective technological toolkit, the most flexible adaptive strategies, the most sophisticated environmental mastery of any hominin species. When conditions changed, we changed our tools and techniques faster than natural selection could change our genes. The age of biological evolution hadn't ended. We were still subject to natural selection. But we had added a new layer. Cultural evolution that operated on timescales thousands of times faster than genetic change. And that combination, biological intelligence refined by the bottleneck plus cultural knowledge accumulated over millennia, made us unstoppable. The environment that had nearly destroyed our species 900,000 years ago was now ours to command. But technology and adaptability only tell part of the story. The real secret weapon that propelled Homo sapiens above all other species wasn't just what we could make or how quickly we could learn. It was who we could trust and how many people we could organize toward a common goal. It was cooperation at a scale no other species had ever achieved. Think about this for a moment. A chimpanzee, our closest living relative, can maintain meaningful social relationships with maybe 50 individuals. That's the limit. Beyond that number, the social bonds break down. The group becomes too large to manage through direct personal interaction. Chimpanzee communities rarely exceed 150 individuals, and when they do, they typically split into smaller groups. Early humans face the same limitation. For millions of years, our ancestors probably lived in small bands of 20 to 50 individuals. Extended family groups that hunted together, shared food, protected each other from predators. This was the social structure that had worked for primates for tens of millions of years. Small, tight-knit groups where everyone knew everyone else. But sometime during that post-bottleneck expansion, something extraordinary happened. Modern humans figured out how to break through this limitation. They developed the cognitive and cultural tools necessary to maintain cooperation with hundreds, eventually thousands of individuals they'd never even met. This wasn't just an incremental improvement. This was a revolution in social organization as profound as the invention of language itself. And it started with a simple but powerful innovation, the division of labor. In small hunter-gatherer bands, everyone had to be a generalist. Men hunted, women gathered. Everyone needed to know how to make tools, build shelters, find water, identify edible plants. Specialization was limited because the group couldn't afford to support anyone who wasn't contributing to immediate survival needs. But as modern human groups grew larger, something remarkable became possible. Not everyone needed to do everything anymore. Some individuals could become specialists, focusing their time and energy on becoming really good at one particular skill. Archaeological evidence from around 40,000 years ago shows this transition beginning. At early modern human sites, you start finding evidence of specialized tool makers, individuals who spent most of their time crafting stone tools, bone needles, or spear points. Their work was too sophisticated, too consistent to be something everyone was doing in their spare time. These were specialists. Other individuals focused on hunting specific types of game. Some became expert trackers, others specialized in fishing or trapping birds. Still others developed expertise in processing hides, making clothing, or preparing plant foods. This specialization created something economists call comparative advantage. Instead of everyone being mediocre at everything, individuals could become excellent at specific tasks. A specialist toolmaker could produce better tools faster than a generalist. A specialized hunter could bring down more game with less effort. But specialization only works if you have a system for sharing the benefits. The toolmaker needs to eat, but they're spending their time making tools, not hunting. The hunter needs tools, but they're spending their time tracking game, not crafting spear points. Enter the gift economy. Modern humans developed elaborate systems of reciprocal exchange that allowed specialists to trade their goods and services. The toolmaker would give spear points to hunters, who would give meat to the toolmaker. The hide processor would provide clothing to both, receiving tools and food in return. This might sound simple, like basic bartering, but it was actually far more sophisticated than that. These weren't immediate quid pro quo exchanges. They were long-term reciprocal relationships built on trust, reputation, and social obligation. When a hunter gave meat to a toolmaker, they weren't expecting immediate payment. They were investing in a relationship. They were building social capital that they could draw on later when they needed new tools. The whole system ran on delayed reciprocity, on the confidence that generosity would eventually be returned. This required a cognitive breakthrough. You had to be able to remember who owed what to whom. You had to track complex social relationships over long periods of time. You had to calculate the value of different goods and services, weighing immediate needs against future benefits. You also had to be able to identify and punish cheaters. In any cooperative system, there's always temptation to take without giving back. Free riders who accept generosity but never reciprocate. If too many people cheat, the whole system collapses. Modern humans developed sophisticated social mechanisms for dealing with this problem. Reputation systems where everyone knew who could be trusted and who couldn't. Social sanctions from gossip and ridicule to ostracism and expulsion from the group. In extreme cases, even execution of persistent free riders. The archaeological record provides tantalizing hints of these enforcement mechanisms. Starting around 30,000 years ago, we find evidence of interpersonal violence that looks different from warfare or hunting accidents. Injuries that suggest punishment or execution. Individuals killed by their own group rather than by outsiders. This sounds harsh, but it was essential. Without the ability to punish cheaters, cooperation at large scales would be impossible. The threat of social sanction kept everyone honest, or at least honest enough to make the system work. But cooperation extended far beyond individual bands. One of modern humanity's most impressive innovations was the creation of trade networks that connected distant communities. Archaeological sites from 40,000 years ago contain raw materials that originated hundreds of miles away. Obsidian from volcanic regions found in camps 300 miles distant. Seashells from coastal areas discovered at inland sites. Amber, ochre, and high-quality stone moving across vast distances. This wasn't random. These materials were being systematically traded through networks of exchange relationships that connected dozens, maybe hundreds of separate communities. A coastal group would trade shells to an inland group, who would trade them to a mountain group, who would trade them to a group on the other side of the mountains. These trade networks required trust between groups who might rarely meet face to face. They required a shared understanding of value, agreements about fair exchange rates, and mechanisms for resolving disputes. They required, in other words, the beginnings of economic systems. But even more importantly, these trade networks created interdependence. Groups that traded regularly had incentive not to fight. Warfare disrupts trade, and trade brought access to resources you couldn't get locally. Better to maintain peaceful relations with your trading partners than to risk losing access to the obsidian or shells or ochre you needed. Of course, conflict still happened. Modern humans weren't pacifists, but they had developed something previous human species hadn't: the ability to choose cooperation over conflict when it served their interests. And increasingly, cooperation served their interests better than constant warfare. To make these expanding social networks function, modern humans needed rules, not just informal customs, but actual codes of behavior that everyone agreed to follow, the beginnings of law. We can't know exactly what these early legal systems looked like. They probably weren't written down for another 35,000 years. But we can infer their existence from the complexity of social organization we see in the archaeological record. You can't maintain trade networks spanning hundreds of miles without agreements about property, contracts, and dispute resolution. You can't support specialists without rules about reciprocal obligation. You can't punish free riders without consensus about what constitutes fair contribution to the group. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer societies, the closest living analogues to our ancient ancestors, find sophisticated legal systems everywhere they look. Rules about resource sharing, marriage, inheritance, conflict resolution, procedures for collective decision-making, methods for mediating disputes, graduated responses to rule violations. These aren't simple societies with simple rules. They're complex societies with nuanced legal systems that have been refined over thousands of generations. Early modern humans almost certainly had similar systems. They had to. You can't organize hundreds of cooperating individuals without them. Many of these rules probably took the form of moral codes, deeply held beliefs about right and wrong behavior that were internalized during childhood. Don't steal from your neighbors. Share food with those who are hungry. Honor your agreements. Protect children. Care for the elderly. Punish those who break the rules. These moral intuitions weren't arbitrary cultural inventions. They were adaptations, psychological mechanisms shaped by natural selection to support large-scale cooperation. Groups with strong moral codes could maintain cooperation more effectively. They could grow larger, survive disasters better, outcompete groups with weaker social cohesion. Over thousands of generations, natural selection favored individuals who internalized cooperative norms. People who felt genuine guilt when they cheated, genuine anger when they witnessed injustice, genuine satisfaction when they helped others. These emotional responses weren't just cultural programming. They were evolved psychological mechanisms that made cooperation feel natural and cheating feel wrong. But maintaining group cohesion required more than just rules and moral feelings. It required something to bind people together emotionally, to create a sense of shared identity that transcended individual interest. It required ritual and ceremony. Starting around 40,000 years ago, we see an explosion of ritual behavior in the archaeological record. Elaborate burial ceremonies with grave goods, cave paintings that must have required coordinated group effort, carved figurines and decorated tools that served no practical purpose, musical instruments, bone flutes, and percussion devices. These artifacts are evidence of something profound. Modern humans were creating shared cultural experiences. They were gathering together for ceremonies, celebrations, religious rituals. They were singing, dancing, telling stories, creating art together. This might seem like frivolous behavior, luxury activities that you'd only engage in after taking care of survival needs, but that's exactly wrong. These rituals were survival needs. They were the social glue that held large groups together. When you participate in a ritual with others, something happens in your brain. The synchronized movement, the shared emotion, the collective focus on a common purpose, all trigger the release of neurochemicals that create feelings of bonding and belonging. You feel connected to the people around you. You identify with them. You're willing to trust them, cooperate with them, even sacrifice for them. This is why every human society ever studied, without exception, engages in collective rituals, religious ceremonies, festivals, communal dances, military parades, sports events. The specific forms vary enormously, but the underlying function is always the same, creating emotional bonds between individuals, forging groups into unified communities. For early modern humans, these rituals probably revolved around hunting, fertility, seasonal changes, and significant life events. Ceremonies before major hunts to coordinate the group and build confidence. Celebrations after successful hunts to reinforce cooperation and share the benefits. Coming-of-age rituals to integrate young adults into the community. burial ceremonies to process grief and reaffirm social bonds. These weren't optional extras. They were essential technologies for scaling up cooperation. You can maintain a 50-person band through personal relationships alone, but to coordinate 200 people, or 500, or 1,000, you need something more. You need shared myths, collective rituals, and cultural identities that make people think of themselves as part of something larger than their immediate family. Of course, the flip side of group identity is conflict with outsiders. When you create an us, you inevitably create a them. Modern humans weren't immune to this. The archaeological record shows plenty of evidence for violence between groups. Skeletal remains with weapon injuries, fortified settlements, mass graves suggesting massacres, cave paintings depicting what look like battles. By 10,000 years ago, warfare was clearly a regular feature of human life. But even warfare, paradoxically, contributed to the evolution of cooperation. Groups that could coordinate effectively in battle, that could organize warriors, develop military strategies, and maintain discipline under pressure, those groups survived. Groups that couldn't coordinate as well got conquered or displaced. This created what evolutionary biologists call group selection pressure. Natural selection wasn't just operating on individuals anymore. It was operating on whole communities. Groups with better cooperation survived and expanded. Groups with weaker cooperation disappeared. Over thousands of generations, this pressure shaped human psychology in profound ways. We evolved to be fiercely loyal to our in-groups, willing to sacrifice personal interest for group benefit. We developed intuitive moral responses that punish free riders and reward cooperators. We became capable of coordinating with large numbers of individuals toward common goals, but we also evolved capacities for tribalism, xenophobia, and intergroup conflict. The same psychological mechanisms that make us cooperate so effectively with our in-group can make us hostile toward outsiders. This is the dark side of human cooperation, the shadow that has followed us from the Stone Age into the modern world. However, cooperation within groups wasn't just about warriors and hunters. One of modern humanity's most important innovations was the systematic care of children and the elderly. This might not sound revolutionary, but it represented a fundamental shift in life history strategy. In most mammal species, individuals reproduce, care for their offspring until independence, and then either die or become peripheral to the group. Once you're past reproductive age, you're evolutionary deadweight, consuming resources without contributing to the next generation. Humans broke this pattern. Somewhere in our evolutionary history we developed extended post-reproductive lifespans. Women, in particular, continue living for decades after menopause, long after they can have children of their own. This is weird. From a purely genetic standpoint, it seems wasteful. Why invest resources in individuals who can't reproduce? But the grandmother hypothesis, developed by anthropologist Kristen Hawkes and her colleagues, explains why this makes perfect evolutionary sense. Older women, freed from the demands of pregnancy and infant care, can contribute enormously to their grandchildren's survival. They have decades of accumulated knowledge: which plants are edible, where to find water during droughts, how to treat injuries and illnesses. They can gather food, process materials, and care for children while younger adults focus on hunting and gathering. Archaeological evidence supports this. At modern human sites from 30,000 years ago, we find evidence of elderly individuals living well past reproductive age. We find complex tool technologies that would take years to master, suggesting knowledge was being passed from experienced elders to younger learners. We find evidence of specialized food processing, particularly of plant foods, work often done by older women in modern hunter-gatherer societies. This created a virtuous cycle of cultural accumulation. Each generation could build on the knowledge of the previous generation. Children learned from parents, grandparents, even great-grandparents. Skills became more sophisticated. Technologies improved. Cultural knowledge expanded. This is fundamentally different from genetic evolution, which operates over thousands of generations. Cultural evolution can happen in a single generation. A clever individual discovers a better way to make tools, teaches it to their children, and suddenly the whole community has access to superior technology. The presence of grandmothers and grandfathers, too, accelerated this process enormously. They were living repositories of cultural knowledge, teachers and advisors who ensured information was transmitted accurately across generations. But it wasn't just elders caring for young. Modern humans developed collective childcare systems where multiple adults shared responsibility for children. Mothers, fathers, grandparents, aunts, uncles, older siblings, even unrelated community members all participated in raising children. This is unusual among primates. In most species, mothers bear almost exclusive responsibility for infant care. Fathers often contribute nothing beyond genetic material. But human children are so demanding, require so much time and resources to raise successfully that mothers couldn't manage alone. The development of cooperative breeding, where multiple individuals help raise offspring, allowed modern human women to have children more frequently and raise more of them to adulthood. Instead of spacing births 4 or 5 years apart like chimpanzees do, humans could have children every 2 or 3 years. This demographic advantage compounded over generations. Human populations could grow faster than Neanderthal or Denisovan populations. When disaster struck, droughts or disease or conflict, humans could bounce back more quickly. When new territories opened up, humans could fill them faster. All of this cooperation, from specialization and trade to ritual and collective childcare, allowed human groups to grow larger and more complex. By 15,000 years ago, some modern human communities had hundreds of permanent residents. By 10,000 years ago, we see settlements with thousands of people. These weren't just bigger versions of small hunter-gatherer bands. They were qualitatively different, with hierarchies, specialized roles, formal leadership, and complex social structures. They were the proto-civilizations that would eventually give rise to cities, states, and empires. But they were still built on the same foundation, the uniquely human capacity for large-scale cooperation with non-relatives, the ability to trust strangers, follow shared rules, participate in collective endeavors, and sacrifice individual interests for group benefits. This capacity, more than any tool or weapon, more than intelligence or language, is what made Homo sapiens the dominant species on Earth. We didn't conquer the planet through individual prowess. We did it through cooperation at scales no other species could match. From families to tribes to civilizations of millions, we mastered the art of working together toward common goals, and we did it by developing social structures, cultural practices, and psychological mechanisms that made cooperation not just possible, but natural, even deeply satisfying. The modern world, with its cities, nations, and global institutions, with its capacity to coordinate billions of individuals toward shared purposes, is the direct descendant of those first experiments in large-scale cooperation 40,000 years ago. We're still using the same basic social technologies, just scaled up to unimaginable proportions. That small population of bottleneck survivors, those 1,280 individuals struggling to stay alive 900,000 years ago, would never have imagined what their descendants would build. But they laid the groundwork, developing the cognitive and social capacities that made everything else possible. They learned to cooperate, and that changed everything. But tools and fire and social cooperation were only part of the story. what really separated modern humans from every other species on Earth, including our evolutionary cousins, wasn't what we could make with our hands, it was what we could create with our mouths. Language. Now every animal communicates. Wolves howl, bees dance, dolphins click. Even bacteria send chemical signals to coordinate behavior. But human language, true language, is something fundamentally different. It's not just more complex than animal communication. It's a different kind of thing entirely. Think about what you're doing right now. You're listening to sounds, arbitrary noises really, that I'm making with vocal cords and tongue and lips. But these sounds aren't random. They're organized into patterns you recognize as words. Those words combine into sentences that convey meaning. Not just simple meanings like danger or food, but abstract concepts, hypothetical situations, stories about things that happened long ago or might happen in the future. I can tell you about events that occurred 900,000 years ago, about people who never existed, about scientific theories and mathematical concepts and philosophical ideas. I can describe things you've never seen, places you've never been, emotions you've never felt. And you understand. Your brain takes these arbitrary sound patterns and reconstructs complex ideas, builds mental images, forms abstract understanding. No other species can do this. Chimpanzees can learn maybe 150 signs in captivity. Impressive, but a human toddler knows several thousand words by age 3. More importantly, chimps use signs individually, simple associations, food, drink, play. They don't combine them into novel sentences expressing new ideas. They don't use grammar, that invisible architecture that lets us generate infinite meanings from finite elements. Human language is generative. From a vocabulary of maybe 20,000 words and a set of grammatical rules, you can produce and understand sentences that have never been spoken before in human history. This sentence right here, arranged exactly this way, has probably never existed until this moment. Yet, you understand it perfectly. This capability didn't evolve for casual conversation. It emerged because it solved a critical survival problem. The same problem that had been created by the genetic bottleneck. Those scattered populations of survivors needed to share information across distance and time. A band on one side of a valley discovers that a particular plant is poisonous. How do they warn the band on the other side without language? They can't. Someone has to get sick or die, and then that group learns the hard way. With language, you just tell them, don't eat the red berries, they'll kill you. A hunter figures out a better technique for tracking prey. Without language, this innovation might spread slowly through observation and imitation, if it spreads at all. With language, he can explain it, describe it, teach it deliberately. The technique spreads throughout the entire population within a generation. An elder remembers where to find water during droughts. Knowledge gained from her grandmother who survived the last drought 40 years ago. Without language, that information dies with her. With language, she can pass it on. Story becomes survival technology. This is the key insight. Language didn't evolve primarily for social bonding or impressing mates, though it helps with those things. It evolved as the ultimate survival tool, a technology for storing and transmitting information across space and time. And once it emerged, it changed everything, because language enabled something unprecedented in evolutionary history: cultural evolution. Every other species learns primarily through genes. Lions don't teach their cubs to hunt through careful instruction. The cubs have hunting instincts encoded in their DNA. They practice, they watch their mothers, they get better through trial and error. But the fundamental capacity, the drive and basic technique, that's genetic. Humans are different. Yes, we have some instincts. Babies instinctively know to suck for milk. Toddlers have innate fear responses to certain dangers, but almost everything important that humans know, we learn from other humans, not through genes, but through culture. A child born today and raised by wolves wouldn't naturally develop language, mathematics, tool use, or any complex human behavior. They wouldn't intuitively know how to make fire or build shelter or identify edible plants. All that knowledge has to be taught. It has to be transmitted culturally through language. This creates something extraordinary. Cultural evolution operates on completely different timescales than biological evolution. Genetic evolution requires variation, selection, and reproduction. A beneficial mutation appears randomly, provides survival advantage, spreads through the population over many generations. This takes time, thousands of years minimum, usually hundreds of thousands or millions. Cultural evolution just requires someone to have a good idea and tell others about it. A clever human figures out that heating certain stones makes them easier to shape into tools. She teaches this technique to her children, who teach their children, who improve the technique and teach the improved version. Within a few generations, the entire population is using heat-treated stone tools. No genetic change required, no waiting for natural selection, just information transmitted through language. This is revolutionary. It means human populations can adapt to new challenges within lifetimes instead of millennia. It means innovations accumulate instead of arising and disappearing randomly. Most importantly, it means knowledge can compound, each generation building on everything previous generations learned. And the primary vehicle for this cultural transmission was story. Long before writing, before symbolic systems, before any formal education, humans preserved and transmitted knowledge through narrative, stories with characters, plots, morals, vivid details that made them memorable and meaningful. Think about how you learned things as a child, not through abstract principles or dry recitation of facts, but through stories, cautionary tales about children who wandered too far from camp and got lost, exciting narratives about successful hunts that demonstrated tracking techniques, legends about ancestors who survived disasters by being clever or brave or prepared. These weren't just entertainment, they were educational technology. A story about a hunter who ignored the signs of a territorial predator and got killed teaches predator awareness far more effectively than simply saying "watch for predators." The narrative creates emotional engagement. You imagine yourself in the hunter's position. You feel his fear, his pain. Your brain encodes that information deeply, associates it with emotional weight. You remember stories in ways you don't remember abstract information. Archaeological evidence suggests storytelling was central to human culture from very early periods. Cave paintings from 40,000 years ago appear to depict narratives, sequential scenes showing hunts, migrations, possibly mythological events. These weren't random decorations. They were story archives, ways of preserving important cultural information in visual form. Around campfires at night, our ancestors would have recounted these stories verbally. The hunt where Krog killed the mammoth by driving it into the ravine. The winter when the tribe had to shelter in the southern caves because northern territories were blocked by floods. The time when Mira discovered that certain mushrooms could heal infected wounds. Each story contained survival information, hunting techniques, geographical knowledge, medical discoveries, social wisdom about cooperation, leadership, conflict resolution, all encoded in memorable narrative form and transmitted from generation to generation. And because language allowed abstract thinking, humans could do something no other species managed. We could talk about things that didn't exist yet, hypotheticals, plans, possibilities. What if we drove the herd toward the cliff instead of trying to separate individuals? Next winter we should gather more firewood earlier. If we worked together, we could build a shelter large enough for 3 families. This capacity for discussing the non-existent, the not yet real, was cognitively demanding but immensely powerful. It allowed humans to plan, to coordinate complex activities, to imagine solutions before implementing them. We could make mistakes in imagination instead of reality, test ideas verbally before committing resources. Other primates can solve problems through trial and error. Only humans can solve them through discussion. And as populations grew and interactions between groups became more frequent, something else emerged: symbolic systems. The earliest symbolic systems we know about are remarkably abstract. Ochre patterns on rocks from 70,000 years ago, bead sequences that might have represented numerical information or social status, notched bones that appear to track lunar cycles or seasonal patterns. These weren't decoration, they were external memory storage, ways of recording information that exceeded human brain capacity to retain reliably. A hunter can remember roughly where good hunting grounds are located, but precise navigation over hundreds of miles requires better information. Notches on a stick indicating days of travel between landmarks, patterns of stones marking water sources, visual symbols representing different types of terrain or hazards. These proto-writing systems multiplied the effectiveness of language. Now information could be stored not just in human memory, but in physical objects. A skilled tracker could create a map, a symbolic representation of territory that any other human who understood the symbols could interpret. Knowledge became portable and permanent. By 30,000 years ago, humans were creating increasingly sophisticated symbolic systems. Cave paintings that might have served as teaching tools, showing young hunters the anatomy and behavior of prey animals. Carved figurines that possibly represented spirits or ancestors, suggesting emerging religious or mythological systems. Decorative patterns on tools and clothing that indicated tribal affiliation or individual status. All of these symbols did the same thing. They allowed humans to share complex information efficiently, to coordinate behavior across large groups, to maintain social cohesion through shared meanings. And then came the revolution that would change everything. Writing. The first true writing systems emerged around 5,000 years ago, relatively recently in human history. But their impact was immediate and profound. Spoken language is ephemeral. A story told around a campfire exists only while someone's speaking and someone else is listening. Once the speaker dies, unless they've passed the story to someone else, it's gone forever. Written. Language is permanent. A text created 5,000 years ago can be read today by anyone who understands the writing system. Knowledge becomes truly immortal, transmitted not just across distance and from person to person, but across centuries and millennia. This created exponential acceleration in knowledge accumulation. Before writing, each generation could build only on what they could learn directly from the previous generation. The amount of knowledge any individual could acquire was limited by memory capacity and lifespan. Complex ideas that required years to develop often died with their originators. After writing, knowledge could accumulate indefinitely. Libraries became civilizational memory banks. A scholar in ancient Greece could read mathematical texts written centuries earlier in Babylon, build on those ideas, and record new discoveries for future generations to expand further. This compounding effect transformed human technological and intellectual progress. For hundreds of thousands of years, human cultural evolution had been relatively slow. Yes, faster than genetic evolution, but still measured in millennia. Stone tool technologies improved gradually over tens of thousands of years. After writing, the pace accelerated dramatically. Within a few thousand years, humans went from basic agriculture to complex mathematics, from simple villages to vast empires, from oral tradition to sophisticated literature and philosophy. But writing did something else equally important. It enabled a completely new kind of social coordination. Teaching. Every animal species that cares for offspring engages in some form of learning. Bear cubs watch their mothers fish. Otter pups practice hunting techniques under parental supervision. But this is mostly learning through observation and imitation. The parent demonstrates, the offspring copies. Humans developed deliberate instruction, teaching as a specialized activity, designed to efficiently transfer specific knowledge. A master flint knapper doesn't just make tools while apprentices watch. He explains what he's doing, describes how to identify good stone, where to strike to get the right flaking pattern, how to correct mistakes. He can use language to convey the invisible reasoning behind visible actions. This makes human learning incredibly efficient. A young hunter can acquire in months what might take years to figure out through observation alone. Complex skills that might be difficult to reverse engineer just by watching, glass-making, metalworking, advanced weapon crafting, become reproducible through verbal instruction. And teaching enables something even more powerful. Specialization. In species that learn primarily through observation, every individual needs to be a generalist. They need to learn everything necessary for survival because there's no efficient way to exchange specialized knowledge. In human societies with language and teaching, individuals can specialize. One person becomes expert at tracking. Another specializes in plant knowledge. A third focuses on tool making. Each develops deep expertise in their domain and teaches those skills to interested students. The society as a whole becomes more capable than any individual could be alone. The collective knowledge of the group far exceeds what any single brain could contain. This is how human groups solve problems that would be impossible for individuals or even small bands. You want to hunt a mammoth? That requires coordinated action from dozens of people with different specializations, trackers to locate the herd, strategists to plan the approach, weapon makers who've crafted effective spears, experienced hunters who know animal behavior, younger members who can run fast to drive the animal toward the kill zone. Without language, coordinating all these different roles would be nearly impossible. With language, you can plan the entire operation in advance, explain everyone's role, adjust the strategy based on conditions, coordinate timing, share a mental model of how the hunt will proceed so everyone knows what to expect. This coordination capacity scaled up to enable increasingly ambitious projects. Building permanent settlements required organizing labor, different people gathering materials, others constructing walls, still others planning layouts and managing resources. Agriculture required coordinating planting schedules, water management, harvest timing across many families. Eventually, humans were building cities, vast construction projects requiring thousands of workers, following complex plans developed by architects and engineers. Armies coordinating movements of tens of thousands of soldiers across multiple battle theatres. Trade networks spanning continents, moving goods through dozens of intermediaries speaking different languages but sharing common commercial vocabularies. None of this would have been possible without sophisticated language enabling coordination at scale. But perhaps language's most important function, the thing that truly separated humans from every other species, was its ability to create shared realities. Here's a remarkable fact. Chimpanzees can't cooperate effectively in groups larger than about 50 individuals. Once chimp groups exceed that size, they fracture. There's too much competition, not enough social cohesion. The individuals don't have strong enough bonds to maintain cooperation. Modern humans regularly cooperate in groups of millions. Cities contain people who will never meet each other, yet they follow the same laws, use the same currency, participate in the same economic systems. How is this possible? How do you create cooperation between strangers who have no personal relationship? Through shared narrative, through collective fictions that everyone agrees to believe in. Consider money. A piece of paper or metal or digital entry in a database has no intrinsic value. You can't eat it, or wear it, or use it for shelter. It's valuable only because everyone agrees to pretend it's valuable. That agreement, that shared fiction, is maintained through narrative. Stories about economy, trade, value, obligation, debt. Or consider nations. There's no physical thing called France or China or Kenya. Borders are imaginary lines that exist only in human minds, maintained through collective agreement enforced by shared narrative about territory, sovereignty, citizenship, or religions. Millions of people coordinate their behavior around beliefs in entities and realms that may or may not exist physically. They follow moral codes, organize societies, fight wars, based entirely on shared stories about divine will and cosmic purpose. These collective fictions, these shared narratives, are what anthropologists call social realities. They exist because humans agree they exist, and language is what maintains that agreement. A prehistoric human encounters another human from a different band. Potentially dangerous situation. Are they friend or enemy? Competitor or potential ally? Now imagine they discover they both belong to the same tribe, worship the same ancestral spirits, speak the same language, know the same stories about the tribe's origins and heroes. Suddenly they're not strangers, they're kin, connected by shared narrative. This is how language enabled human cooperation to scale beyond immediate family groups. Through stories that created artificial kinship, imagined communities of thousands or millions of people who've never met but identify as part of the same group because they share the same narratives. Early humans used myths about common ancestors. Everyone in the tribe was descended from the same legendary founder, so everyone was family. Later societies used religions. Everyone who believed in the same gods belonged to the same community. Modern societies use national narratives, citizenship based on shared stories about national identity and historical destiny. Different stories, same function, creating social cohesion through collective narrative, and this capacity for shared fiction enabled something unprecedented in natural history. Cooperation between strangers, large-scale coordination of people who had no genetic relationship, no personal bond, no direct benefit from helping each other. They cooperated because they shared the same stories, and those stories told them cooperation was right, necessary, sacred. This is why modern humans won. Not because we were smarter than Neanderthals, brain size didn't give us the advantage. Not because we were stronger, we were actually more fragile physically. Not because we had better tools initially. The early encounters show Neanderthals and modern humans with roughly equivalent technology. We won because we could coordinate in larger groups. A Neanderthal band might consist of 20 to 30 closely related individuals, extended family who'd known each other all their lives. Effective. Cooperation within that group, but limited ability to ally with other bands. No shared narratives creating artificial kinship. A modern human band might be the same size, but they could form alliances with other bands through shared stories, trade networks, mutual defense pacts, coordinated territorial expansion. When modern humans encountered Neanderthals, they could mobilize 100 people to the Neanderthals' 30. Not because individual modern humans were more capable, but because language had given us the ability to create cooperation at scale. Over thousands of years, this advantage compounded. Modern human populations grew larger because they could maintain social cohesion across bigger groups. Larger populations meant more innovations, more specialization, more accumulated knowledge. That knowledge transmitted culturally through language and teaching meant faster adaptation, better technologies, more effective strategies. By 30,000 years ago, modern humans had developed cultures so rich and complex that they were essentially operating on a different plane of existence than other species. We weren't just surviving in our environment. We were creating our own cultural environments, worlds of meaning and narrative that existed only in our collective imagination, but shaped behavior as powerfully as any physical reality. We told story about how the world worked, and those stories became self-fulfilling prophecies. We imagined social structures, laws, moralities, and then organized our entire societies around those imaginations. We were the species that lived in two worlds simultaneously. The physical world of matter and energy, where we still had to eat and sleep and avoid predators like every other animal. And the narrative world of meaning and symbol, where we created elaborate fictions about gods and nations and money and purpose, and then acted as if those fictions were more real than physical reality itself. This was the true cognitive revolution, not just bigger brains or better tools, but the capacity to create and inhabit shared imaginary realities that enabled cooperation at scales nature had never seen before, and it all came down to language. The ability to make sounds that conveyed not just danger or food, but complex abstract meanings. To tell stories that created emotional bonds between strangers, to teach skills deliberately, to accumulate knowledge across generations, to coordinate activities involving thousands of individuals, to imagine better futures and convince others to work toward them. Language was the ultimate survival technology, more important than fire or tools or agriculture, because language was what enabled all of those other innovations to spread, to improve, to accumulate into the vast edifice of human culture and technology. Those 280 bottleneck survivors who made it through the genetic crisis, they had the basic capacity for complex language. But their descendants, modern humans emerging from Africa 60,000 years ago, had refined that capacity into something transcendent. We had become the storytelling species, the species that lives as much in narrative as in physical reality, the species that coordinates through shared fiction and accumulates knowledge across millennia. And once that happened, our dominance over every other species, including our evolutionary cousins, was inevitable. Not because we were the strongest or the fastest or even the smartest in raw cognitive power, but because we could tell each other stories, and those stories changed everything. Around 70,000 years ago, something remarkable happened. A small group of humans, maybe just a few hundred individuals, stood at the shores of the Red Sea, looking across the narrow strait that separated Africa from the Arabian Peninsula. They had no idea they were about to embark on the greatest journey in human history. No idea that their descendants would eventually walk on every continent, survive in every climate, and become the most widespread large mammal species the planet had ever seen. This wasn't the first time humans had left Africa. There had been earlier migrations, failed experiments that either died out or left only faint genetic traces. But this time was different. This group carried something new. All the cognitive tools, all the social innovations, all the technological advantages that had been developing over hundreds of thousands of years. They were ready for what came next in ways their predecessors hadn't been. The crossing itself was probably anticlimactic. During glacial periods, sea levels dropped by hundreds of feet, exposing land bridges and narrowing water gaps to distances that could be crossed on simple rafts or even by swimming. From Africa to Arabia was maybe 10 miles at its narrowest point, a journey that could be made in a single day. But what that crossing represented was monumental. For the first time, anatomically and behaviorally, modern humans were leaving their evolutionary homeland, entering territories where they had no ancestral experience, no inherited knowledge of which plants were edible, which animals were dangerous, where water could be found during dry seasons. everything would have to be learned from scratch. And learn they did. The Arabian Peninsula 70,000 years ago was very different from the desert it is today. Wetter, greener, dotted with lakes and rivers. It was actually perfect for human expansion. Within just a few thousand years, human populations had spread across the entire peninsula and into the Levant, establishing the first permanent human presence outside Africa. This is where things get interesting, because this wasn't a slow, gradual expansion over millions of years like earlier human species had achieved. This was explosive. Archaeological and genetic evidence shows that within 10,000 years of leaving Africa, modern humans had reached southern Asia. Within 20,000 years, they were in Australia. By 45,000 years ago, they had entered Europe. By 15,000 years ago, they had colonized the Americas. Think about that timeline. In less than 60,000 years, a period that's barely a tick on the evolutionary clock, humans went from being confined to Africa to inhabiting every continent except Antarctica. They crossed deserts, mountain ranges, and entire oceans. They survived in environments ranging from equatorial rainforest to Arctic tundra, from coastal regions to landlocked plateaus at altitudes that would make most mammals struggle to breathe. No other large mammal has ever achieved anything close to this level of geographic diversity. Most species are limited to specific climate zones, specific habitats. Polar bears in the Arctic, lions in the savannas, jaguars in tropical forests. But humans, we were everywhere, and we got there fast. So what made this possible? How did a species that had evolved in African savannas and woodlands suddenly become capable of surviving literally anywhere on Earth? The answer lies in what anthropologists call adaptive versatility, the ability to modify behavior and technology faster than evolution could modify biology. Take the movement into southern Asia. Humans expanding east from Arabia encountered monsoon forests, environments completely unlike anything in Africa. Dense vegetation, different prey animals, unfamiliar plants, new diseases. A specialist species would have struggled or turned back, but humans did what they had become incredibly good at. They innovated. Archaeological sites from this period show rapid adoption of new food sources, shellfish, fish, new species of plants and tubers. Tool technologies adapted to local materials. Bamboo replaced stone in some regions because it was more abundant and easier to work. Settlement patterns changed to match seasonal patterns of resource availability. Within a few generations, these migrants had become as adapted to Asian monsoon forests as their ancestors had been to African grasslands, and they didn't stop. Some groups continued east, eventually reaching the coastlines of Southeast Asia. This is where humans did something unprecedented in mammalian evolution. They took to the sea, not just wading in shallow water or crossing narrow straits, deep ocean voyaging. By 65,000 years ago, humans had reached Australia. This required crossing at least 60 miles of open ocean, a journey that could only have been accomplished with purpose-built watercraft and sophisticated navigation skills. Think about what this means. Early humans, working with stone tools and natural materials, had to develop boat-building technology advanced enough to handle open water. They had to understand tides, currents, and weather patterns. They had to provision these voyages with enough food and fresh water to survive days at sea. This wasn't accidental. You don't drift 60 miles across open ocean and happen to hit a continent. This was intentional exploration, planned migration. It suggests these early humans had developed the cognitive capacity to imagine lands beyond the horizon, to plan complex multi-day journeys, to take enormous calculated risks in pursuit of new territories. And when they arrived in Australia, they encountered an ecosystem unlike anything human eyes had ever seen. Giant marsupials, 3-metre-tall kangaroos, land-dwelling crocodiles. carnivorous lions twice the size of African lions. None of these animals had ever encountered human predators. None had evolved defences against human hunting strategies. Within a few thousand years of human arrival, most of Australia's megafauna were extinct. 50 species of large mammals disappeared, along with giant reptiles and flightless birds. The same pattern would repeat everywhere humans went. Massive, slow-reproducing animals that had survived for millions of years suddenly vanished within centuries of human contact. This wasn't just hunting. It was ecosystem transformation. Humans used fire to manage landscapes, burning undergrowth to promote new growth that would attract grazing animals. In Australia, this fire management was so extensive and systematic that it fundamentally altered the continent's vegetation patterns. Forests gave way to more open woodlands. Fire-sensitive plants declined while fire-adapted species flourished. Humans weren't just adapting to Australia, they were remaking it to suit their needs. Meanwhile, other groups were moving in different directions. Some populations headed north from the Middle East into Central Asia. This presented completely different challenges: colder temperatures, longer winters, different resources. The archaeological record from this period shows humans developing cold weather technologies, better clothing, more sophisticated shelters, ways to preserve and store food through long winters when hunting was difficult. This is also where humans began encountering their evolutionary cousins again. Remember, Neanderthals had been living in Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. They were perfectly adapted to Ice Age conditions, robust, powerful, expert hunters. When modern humans pushed into their territories around 45,000 years ago, the stage was set for one of the most important meetings in human history. We've already covered what happened when these species met: the interbreeding, the competition, the eventual extinction of Neanderthals. But what's important for understanding human expansion is what this contact gave us. Genes. Neanderthal DNA that helped modern humans survive in cold climates. Genetic variants that improved immune system function against European diseases. Adaptations that allowed more efficient processing of different diets. This genetic transfer through interbreeding was like a software update. Modern humans arriving in Europe got instant access to hundreds of thousands of years of Neanderthal evolution. Biological adaptations that had been refined specifically for the environments they were entering. The same thing happened in Asia with Denisovans. Modern humans picked up high-altitude adaptations, cold resistance genes, immune system variants that protected against local pathogens. This is something unique about human expansion. Most species spreading into new territories have to wait for natural selection to slowly modify their biology generation by generation. But humans could acquire pre-adapted genes through interbreeding, dramatically accelerating their ability to thrive in new environments. It was evolution in fast forward. But genetic adaptation was only part of the story. The more important adaptations were cultural. As human populations spread across the globe, they developed specialized knowledge systems perfectly tailored to their local environments. In the Arctic, where Inuit peoples eventually settled, humans learned to survive in one of Earth's most hostile environments. They developed techniques for hunting seals through breathing holes in the ice, for building shelters from snow blocks, for creating waterproof clothing from marine mammal intestines. They learned to prevent scurvy by eating raw organ meat from marine mammals, getting vitamin C from sources that most humans would never think of. In the Amazon rainforest, indigenous peoples developed encyclopedic knowledge of thousands of plant species. Which ones were edible, which were poisonous, which could be used as medicines or tools or poisons for hunting. They learned complex processing techniques that could make toxic plants safe to eat, dramatically expanding available food sources. They developed sustainable hunting practices that allowed them to harvest forest resources without depleting them. In the Pacific Islands, Polynesian voyagers developed navigation systems that allowed them to cross thousands of miles of open ocean without instruments. They read wave patterns, star positions, bird behaviours, cloud formations. They could feel subtle swells with their bodies while lying in their canoes, detecting the presence of distant islands by how ocean currents were disrupted. This knowledge was so sophisticated that they successfully colonized every habitable island in the Pacific, from Hawaii to Easter Island to New Zealand. Each environment demanded different solutions, different knowledge, different technologies, and humans proved capable of developing whatever was needed. This cognitive flexibility, this ability to learn and transmit complex information, was the real secret to human expansion. We didn't need to wait for evolution to give us thick fur for cold climates. We invented clothing. We didn't need biological adaptations for high altitudes. We developed cultural practices that achieved the same results. But there were limits. Even human adaptability had boundaries. The expansion wasn't smooth or continuous. It was marked by bottlenecks, population crashes, genetic founder effects that shaped human diversity in profound ways. When small groups broke off from larger populations to explore new territories, they carried only a fraction of the genetic diversity of the parent population. This is called the founder effect. A handful of people establishing a new settlement might have only a limited number of blood types, genetic variants, or physical traits. As their population grew, everyone would be descended from that small founding group, sharing more genetic similarity than diverse continental populations. This is why indigenous populations in the Americas show less genetic diversity than African populations. All Native Americans are descended from a relatively small group that crossed from Asia into Alaska, probably fewer than 1,000 individuals. That genetic bottleneck shaped the entire continent's human population. The crossing into the Americas was one of the last great human migrations and one of the most dramatic. Around 20,000 years ago, during the peak of the last ice age, so much water was locked up in glaciers that sea levels dropped by over 400 feet. This exposed a land bridge between Siberia and Alaska, a region called Beringia, that was over 1,000 miles wide. Humans in eastern Siberia, following migrating herds of mammoth and bison, gradually moved onto this land bridge. They probably didn't think of it as crossing into a new continent. It was just more territory, more hunting grounds. But they were standing on the threshold of two entire continents that had never known human presence. North and South America, vast territories filled with animals that had never learned to fear human hunters. The crossing happened during a window of opportunity. Too early and ice sheets blocked passage south. Too late and rising seas submerged the land bridge. But for several thousand years, Beringia was a habitable refuge, and humans established populations there. Then, around 15,000 years ago, a corridor opened through the ice sheets covering Canada. Humans poured south. What followed was the most rapid large-scale colonization in human history. Within 2,000 years, humans had spread from Alaska to the tip of South America, covering over 10,000 miles. Archaeological sites dated to 14,000 years ago show human presence all the way down in southern Chile. That's an expansion rate of 5 miles per year, sustained over 2 millennia, and everywhere they went the megafauna disappeared. Mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, American camels, horses, giant beavers the size of bears. Over 70 species of large mammals went extinct in North America within a few thousand years of human arrival. The same pattern played out in South America. Giant armadillos, enormous carnivorous birds, massive short-faced bears. Gone. Scientists still debate exactly why. Some argue it was primarily hunting. Others point to climate change at the end of the Ice Age, but the timing is hard to ignore. These animals had survived multiple climate fluctuations over millions of years, but they couldn't survive humans. The most likely explanation is that it was a combination. Climate stress made large mammals more vulnerable, and human hunting pushed already struggling populations over the edge. Remember, these animals had no evolutionary experience with human hunters, no instinctive fear, no defensive behaviors. They were easy prey for humans with sophisticated weapons and coordinated hunting strategies. In some cases, we have direct evidence. Archaeological sites containing the butchered remains of mammoths preserved mammoth hunting weapons, even paintings and carvings depicting mammoth hunts. Early Americans didn't just hunt these animals opportunistically. They developed specialized technologies specifically for taking down megafauna. The Clovis point, a distinctive spearhead design found across North America, was perfectly engineered for penetrating thick hide and reaching vital organs. But the extinction of the megafauna wasn't just about losing animals. It fundamentally transformed ecosystems. In the Americas, large herbivores had shaped vegetation patterns for millions of years. Their grazing, browsing and trampling maintained open grasslands and prevented forest encroachment. When they disappeared, entire ecosystems shifted. Grasslands turned to forests. Plant species that had depended on megafauna for seed dispersal declined. Predators that had hunted these large prey either went extinct or had to adapt to hunting smaller game. Humans had become a planetary force. Everywhere we went, we didn't just adapt to existing ecosystems, we changed them. Sometimes intentionally through fire management or selective harvesting, sometimes unintentionally through hunting pressure or the introduction of new predators. But the impact was undeniable. By 10,000 years ago, humans had completed the Great Expansion. We had spread from our origins in Africa to every habitable continent. We had survived in deserts where temperatures reached 130 degrees Fahrenheit and in Arctic regions where they dropped to 60 below zero. We lived at sea level and at altitudes over 15,000 feet. We had crossed oceans, mountains and ice sheets. We had adapted to every climate zone, every ecosystem type, every environmental challenge the planet could throw at us. This geographic dispersal had consequences beyond just population distribution. As human groups became isolated from each other by distance and geography, they began diverging culturally and, to a lesser extent, physically. Different environments favoured different physical traits. Populations in high UV environments near the equator maintained dark skin for protection against solar radiation. Populations that migrated to northern latitudes with less sunlight developed lighter skin to facilitate vitamin D production. Body proportions changed too. Populations in cold climates tended towards shorter, stockier builds that conserved heat. Those in hot climates developed taller, lankier frames that dissipated heat more efficiently. But these physical differences were superficial. Genetically, all humans remained remarkably similar. The genetic differences between the most divergent human populations are tiny compared to the differences seen between subspecies or regional populations of most other mammals. A European and an Australian Aboriginal person share over 99.9% of their DNA. They're more genetically similar to each other than two chimpanzees from neighbouring troops in the same forest. This genetic unity, despite geographic separation, tells us something important. The expansion happened fast. There wasn't enough time for significant evolutionary divergence, and throughout this expansion, populations never became completely isolated. There was always contact at the margins, gene flow between neighbouring groups, long-distance trade and migration that prevented complete separation. This maintained a kind of genetic continuity across the species. Innovations that arose in one region could spread to others. Useful genes could move through populations. Cultural knowledge could be exchanged. Humans remained one species even as we spread across the entire planet. This is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of human expansion. We became the most geographically widespread large mammal species on Earth, while maintaining species unity. We didn't split into separate species adapted to different continents like many animals do. We stayed connected enough, mobile enough, and willing enough to interbreed that we remained fundamentally one group. This global expansion set the stage for everything that followed: the development of agriculture, the rise of cities, the emergence of civilizations. All of this was only possible because humans had already spread across the globe, already adapted to every major environment, already developed the cultural and technological foundations needed for the next phase of our journey. Those few hundred individuals who crossed the Red Sea 70,000 years ago had become millions spread across 6 continents. They spoke thousands of different languages, practiced thousands of different cultures, but they were all still recognizably human, still capable of interbreeding, still sharing the same basic cognitive and social capacities, still carrying the genetic legacy of those ancestors who had survived the ancient bottleneck. The age of expansion was ending. The age of civilization was about to begin. For the first 300,000 years of our existence, modern humans lived essentially the same way. Small bands of 20 to 50 people moving through landscapes according to seasonal patterns, following herds of animals, gathering wild plants, setting up temporary camps near water sources. It was a life our ancestors had perfected over hundreds of thousands of years, efficient, sustainable, perfectly adapted to the world as it existed. Then, about 12,000 years ago, something extraordinary happened. Something that would change our species more profoundly than any evolutionary adaptation. We stopped moving. In multiple locations across the planet, almost simultaneously in evolutionary terms, humans began doing something no other large predator had ever seriously attempted. We started planting seeds, not just scattering them randomly, but systematically selecting, planting, tending, and harvesting specific plants. This wasn't an accident. It was the culmination of knowledge that had been accumulating for thousands of years. Hunter-gatherer societies weren't primitive or ignorant. They possessed incredibly sophisticated understanding of their environments. They knew which plants were edible, which were poisonous, which had medicinal properties. They understood animal behavior well enough to predict migrations months in advance. They could track individual animals across miles based on the faintest traces. But they had always used this knowledge to follow nature's patterns. Now, for the first time, they were using it to control those patterns, to force nature to produce what they wanted, where they wanted, when they wanted. The shift happened in at least 7 independent locations around the globe. The Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, where wheat and barley were first cultivated. The Yangtze and Yellow River valleys in China, where rice and millet became staple crops. Mesoamerica, where corn, beans and squash formed the agricultural foundation. The highlands of New Guinea, where taro and bananas were domesticated. Sub-Saharan Africa's Sahel region, where sorghum and African rice were cultivated. The Andes Mountains of South America, where potatoes and quinoa became dietary staples. And eastern North America, where sunflowers, squash and marsh elder were systematically grown. These weren't primitive tribes stumbling onto agriculture by accident. These were sophisticated societies making calculated decisions based on deep ecological knowledge. But why? Why would successful hunter-gatherers give up a lifestyle that had sustained humanity for hundreds of millennia? The traditional answer was that agriculture made life easier, that farming provided more food with less effort, allowing populations to grow and civilizations to flourish. But the archaeological evidence tells a very different story. Early farmers actually worked harder than hunter-gatherers. They spent more hours per day in food production. Their diets were less diverse and less nutritious. Their skeletons show evidence of repetitive stress injuries from grinding grain and hoeing fields. They suffered from more diseases, especially infections that spread easily in settled communities. Their average height decreased as they relied more heavily on cultivated grains and less on varied wild foods. Infant mortality increased, life expectancy dropped. So if agriculture made life harder, why did humans keep doing it? The answer lies in something more subtle and more powerful than convenience: reliability. Hunter-gatherers lived rich lives when conditions were good. When game was abundant and wild plants produced well, they could feed themselves with just a few hours of work per day. But when conditions were bad, when droughts killed the wild plants or animal populations crashed, they starved. Agriculture changed that equation. Yes, farming required constant hard work. Yes, the diet was more monotonous. But crops could be stored. Grain could be kept for months or even years if properly protected from moisture and pests. For the first time in human history, people could build up food reserves that would carry them through bad times. This was revolutionary. A successful harvest could feed a community not just for a season, but for an entire year. Maybe longer if they were careful. That security, that buffer against starvation, was worth the extra labour, worth the less interesting diet, worth all the downsides of agricultural life. But it came with a catch. Once you commit to agriculture, you're locked in. You can't plant crops and then wander off for 6 months. Fields need constant attention. Seeds need to be planted at the right time. Crops need protection from pests and animals. Harvests need to be brought in before they spoil. Agriculture demanded permanence. It forced humans to stay in one place, season after season, year after year, generation after generation. The first permanent settlements started appearing around 12,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent. Places like Jericho in the Jordan Valley, established around 10,000 BCE, with a population that might have reached 2,000 people. Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, a massive stone complex that predates even the earliest agriculture, suggesting that sedentary life might have actually preceded and enabled farming rather than the other way around. These weren't villages in the modern sense. They were clusters of round stone and mud brick houses, packed tightly together, surrounded by fields of cultivated wheat and barley. For people whose ancestors had lived in temporary shelters of hide and wood, this represented a complete transformation of human existence, and it created problems nobody had anticipated. When you live in a small mobile band, waste management is simple. You move. When you settle permanently with hundreds or thousands of people, waste accumulates. Human waste, food scraps, dead animals, the detritus of daily life. Early agricultural settlements were probably incredibly unsanitary by modern standards. Disease spread easily. Parasites flourished. Infections that would have been isolated incidents in mobile bands became epidemics in settled communities. But agriculture had another effect, one that would prove even more transformative than permanent settlement. It created surplus. For the first time in human history, some people could produce more food than they personally needed. Not everyone had to spend their days farming. Some individuals could focus on other activities because the farmers produced enough to feed them too. This is where everything accelerated. Specialization of labor, the ability for different people to focus on different skills, changed human society more profoundly than any genetic mutation ever had. In a hunter-gatherer band, everyone needed to know how to hunt, gather, make tools, build shelters, treat injuries. Sure, some people were better at certain tasks than others, but everyone needed to be generalists capable of survival skills. Agriculture made true specialists possible. Some people could focus entirely on farming, getting better and better at selecting seeds, managing soil, predicting weather patterns. Others could focus on making tools, spending thousands of hours perfecting techniques for crafting better ploughs, sickles, grinding stones. Others could focus on building, developing expertise in construction that allowed for larger and more durable structures. Still others could focus on trade, figuring out how to exchange surplus food for raw materials from other regions. The emergence of specialized craftspeople was revolutionary. A farmer who spent all their time farming produced enough food for themselves and several other people. A potter who spent all their time making pottery could create vessels far superior to anything a part-time potter could produce. A weaver who focused entirely on textile production could develop techniques that would take a casual weaver decades to master. This specialization created a positive feedback loop. Better tools made farming more efficient. More efficient farming created more surplus. More surplus supported more specialists. More specialists created more innovations. More innovations made everything more productive. Within a few thousand years, agricultural settlements were producing goods that would have been impossible in hunter-gatherer societies. Finely crafted pottery for storing and cooking food, woven textiles for clothing and bedding, sophisticated tools optimized for specific tasks, jewelry and decorative objects that served no survival function but demonstrated skill and created social status. But specialization required something else, something that hadn't existed before: coordination. In a hunter-gatherer band, everyone understands what needs to be done. The group is small enough that decisions can be made collectively through discussion and consensus. But in a settlement of 1,000 people with dozens of different specialists, how do you coordinate activity? How do you decide who gets how much food? Who has access to which resources? How do you resolve disputes between people who aren't closely related? You need organization. You need formal systems for making decisions and enforcing them. You need governance. The first formal leadership roles probably emerged from religious specialists, shamans and priests who had always held special status in human societies. In permanent agricultural settlements, these individuals took on new importance. They weren't just spiritual guides anymore. They became coordinators of community activities. They determined when to plant based on astronomical observations. They organized communal construction projects. They mediated disputes according to traditional rules that were becoming increasingly codified. They controlled the surplus food that was stored for emergencies and distributed it when needed. This control over surplus gave them real power. If you could decide who got stored grain during a drought, you controlled life and death. That's not a metaphor. You literally controlled whether people ate or starved. From this control emerged something humans had never experienced before: social stratification, formal hierarchy, class. In hunter-gatherer societies, inequality was limited. Sure, some people were more respected than others based on their skills or wisdom, but everyone had access to the same resources. Nobody could accumulate significantly more material goods than anyone else, because you couldn't carry surplus while mobile. Agriculture changed that completely. Some people controlled more land. Some had access to better fields. Some managed the stored surplus. Some possessed specialized knowledge that made them valuable. And these advantages could be accumulated and passed down to children. For the first time, the circumstances of your birth began determining your life trajectory. If you were born to a family that controlled good farmland, you would probably control good farmland. If you were born to potters, you would likely become a potter. If you were born to the priestly class that managed surplus and organized communal activities, you inherited status and power. This stratification accelerated as settlements grew larger. By 6,000 years ago, the first true cities were emerging. Uruk in Mesopotamia reached a population of 50,000 people by 3000 BCE, larger than any human community that had existed before, larger than most people could even conceptualize. These weren't just big villages, they were completely new forms of human organization. Cities with specialized districts, formal administrations, standing armies, professional priests, and elaborate public architecture. Uruk had massive temples, defensive walls, irrigation systems that managed water from the Euphrates River, complex urban infrastructure that required coordinated labor from thousands of people. Managing this complexity required something else that was entirely new: record keeping. When your community numbers 50,000 people, you can't keep track of who owes what to whom using memory alone. You can't manage grain stores for that many people without detailed records. You can't coordinate construction projects or organize taxation without some way to track obligations and resources. Writing emerged to solve these administrative challenges. The earliest writing systems weren't literature or poetry, they were accounting. Clay tablets from Sumerian cities record deliveries of grain, distributions of rations, inventories of livestock, transfers of land. Dry, boring stuff that happened to be absolutely critical for maintaining complex societies. But once writing existed, it transformed everything. Knowledge could be preserved exactly across generations. A farmer could record detailed observations about crop yields under different conditions. A priest could document astronomical patterns used for creating calendars. A merchant could maintain records of trade relationships across hundreds of miles. A scribe could copy and preserve the accumulated wisdom of previous generations. For the first time in human history, knowledge stopped being limited to what individuals could remember and pass down through oral tradition. It could be written, stored, referenced, and built upon systematically. This was as revolutionary as agriculture itself. Cities in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and China began developing increasingly sophisticated writing systems. Cuneiform in Mesopotamia evolved from simple pictograms for goods into a complete written language capable of expressing abstract concepts. Egyptian hieroglyphics developed similar complexity. Chinese characters emerged independently with their own unique approach to representing language visually. These writing systems enabled something unprecedented: the accumulation of technical knowledge across multiple generations. A craftsman could read instructions written by masters who died a century before. An architect could study building techniques developed in distant cities. A priest could access astronomical observations recorded over thousands of years. The pace of innovation accelerated dramatically. Metallurgy emerged as people learned to extract copper from ore, then later figured out how to create bronze by alloying copper with tin. Bronze tools and weapons were superior to stone in almost every way: harder, more durable, capable of holding sharper edges. The Bronze Age, beginning around 3300 BCE in the Near East, represented another technological revolution. Access to bronze weapons created military advantages that allowed some cities to dominate others. Bronze tools made agriculture more efficient, enabling food surpluses that could support even larger populations. The trade networks required to obtain copper and tin, which were rarely found in the same locations, created economic connections spanning hundreds or thousands of miles. Then came another innovation that seemed simple but was actually profound: the wheel. Developed around 3500 BCE in Mesopotamia, initially for pottery making, then quickly adapted for transportation. Wheeled carts could move far more goods with less effort than humans carrying loads on their backs. This made trade more efficient, enabling cities to import resources from greater distances and export their own products more widely. Mathematics developed to handle the increasing complexity of trade, taxation, and construction. The Sumerians created sophisticated systems for calculation, including early forms of algebra and geometry. Egyptian architects used mathematical principles to design pyramids with astonishing precision. Chinese mathematicians developed their own advanced systems for calculation. Astronomy became increasingly sophisticated as priests tracked celestial movements to create accurate calendars. Agricultural societies needed precise calendars to know when to plant and harvest. Religious ceremonies needed to be scheduled according to astronomical events. The ability to predict eclipses and planetary movements gave priestly classes even more authority. They seemed to understand the fundamental workings of the cosmos. In a sense, they did. Their astronomical observations were remarkably accurate, laying foundations for scientific understanding that would develop over subsequent millennia. But agriculture was changing more than just human society and technology. It was changing human biology itself. The shift to a grain-heavy diet created new selection pressures. Populations that relied heavily on dairy farming developed lactose tolerance, the ability to digest milk as adults, something most humans and all other mammals lose after childhood. In populations that domesticated cattle and consumed dairy products, individuals with genetic mutations allowing lactose tolerance had survival advantages. They could access additional calories that others couldn't digest. Over just a few thousand years, lactose tolerance became common in populations with long histories of dairy farming, while remaining rare in populations without such traditions. Similarly, populations that relied on starchy crops like rice and potatoes developed higher numbers of copies of genes for producing amylase, the enzyme that helps digest starch. More amylase meant more efficient starch digestion, meaning better nutrition from grain-heavy diets. The farming lifestyle itself created selection pressures. Resistance to infectious diseases became increasingly important as dense populations facilitated disease spread. Individuals with genetic advantages in immune function were more likely to survive epidemics and pass on their genes. Over thousands of years, farming populations developed different immune profiles than hunter-gatherer populations, better adapted to the disease environment of agricultural life, but potentially more vulnerable to other health challenges. Agriculture even changed human skull structure and dental development. The shift from varied, tough wild foods to softer, more homogeneous agricultural diets resulted in smaller jaws and more crowded teeth in many populations. Modern orthodontic problems, the need for wisdom tooth removal, the prevalence of dental crowding, these trace back to changes that began with agriculture. Our bodies were still adapted for hunter-gatherer life, but we had committed to an entirely different existence. The mismatch between our evolutionary heritage and our agricultural lifestyle created health consequences we're still dealing with today. But perhaps the most profound change was psychological and social. Hunter-gatherers lived in a world they adapted to. Farmers lived in a world they had created. This shift in relationship with nature was unprecedented. Instead of moving through environments shaped by natural forces, agricultural humans reshaped environments to suit their needs. They cleared forests to create fields. They diverted rivers to irrigate crops. They eliminated predators that threatened their livestock. They selected for specific traits in plants and animals, engaging in a form of artificial evolution that bent other species to human purposes. This was power on a scale our species had never possessed. The power to reshape the living world according to human design. It was also the beginning of environmental problems that would eventually threaten sustainability. Intensive agriculture depleted soil nutrients, requiring farmers to either let fields lie fallow periodically or find ways to replenish fertility. Irrigation could lead to salt buildup in soil, eventually making land infertile. Deforestation for farmland caused erosion and altered local climates. Some of the earliest civilizations collapsed partly because they degraded the environments that sustained them. The Sumerian civilization declined partly because salt buildup from irrigation made their fields increasingly unproductive. The Maya civilization in Mesoamerica may have been weakened by deforestation and soil depletion that reduced agricultural productivity. But in the short term, agriculture was an overwhelming success by one measure: population. The global human population, which had remained relatively stable at a few million people for hundreds of thousands of years, began growing exponentially. By 10,000 years ago, there were perhaps 5 million humans on Earth. By 5,000 years ago, that number had increased to perhaps 50 million. By 2,000 years ago, it reached 300 million. The descendants of those 280 bottleneck survivors who'd slowly expanded to millions over 700,000 years had increased 100-fold in just 10,000 years, all because of agriculture. Those millions of people were no longer living as their ancestors had. They weren't small bands following game animals and gathering wild plants. They were farmers, craftspeople, merchants, priests, warriors, administrators, scribes. They lived in permanent structures, often in cities with tens of thousands of neighbours. They followed formal laws enforced by institutional authority. They worshipped in temples designed by architects and constructed by coordinated labour. They recorded their activities in writing systems that preserved knowledge across generations. They used technologies, bronze tools, wheeled vehicles, irrigation systems that would have seemed like magic to their hunter-gatherer ancestors. The agricultural revolution had created something entirely new on Earth: civilization. Complex societies with formal institutions, technological sophistication, accumulated knowledge, and the capacity to reshape their environments fundamentally. It had happened quickly. Just 10,000 years from the first planted seeds to the first true cities. An eye blink in evolutionary time. But it wasn't evolution anymore. Not biological evolution anyway. Humans were still genetically almost identical to their ancestors from 50,000 years ago. The changes weren't in our genes, they were in our cultures, our technologies, our social organizations. Cultural evolution had taken over from genetic evolution as the primary driver of human change. And cultural evolution moved faster, far faster. Ideas could spread across populations in generations rather than millennia. Technologies could be copied and improved in years rather than eons. Social innovations could transform societies in decades rather than geological epochs. The bottleneck, those desperate 117,000 years that had nearly destroyed humanity, had created the genetic foundation for intelligence, cooperation, and adaptability. The recovery period had refined those traits and split human populations into multiple species, competing across 3 continents. The Upper Paleolithic had given modern humans the technological and cognitive advantages that let them outlast their evolutionary cousins. But agriculture had unlocked a completely different kind of power. The power to reshape the world itself, to create environments designed around human needs, to support populations orders of magnitude larger than natural landscapes could sustain, to build civilizations that would eventually dominate every ecosystem on the planet. This was the moment when Homo Sapiens stopped being just another species in Earth's ecosystem and became something unprecedented. A species that could bend the entire biosphere to its purposes. For better and for worse, the world would never be the same. The age of human dominance hadn't just begun. It had accelerated beyond anything the natural world had ever seen. And it all traced back through those city-building farmers, through the Upper Paleolithic innovators, through the 3 human species spreading across continents, through the genetic bottleneck that had compressed everything, back to those 280 survivors who had refused to go extinct. Everything that followed, the cities, the writing, the mathematics, the astronomy, the civilizations that would eventually reshape the entire planet, all of it was built on the foundation laid by ancestors who had survived the impossible and kept surviving, generation after generation, until survival wasn't enough anymore, until humanity decided to do something that no other species had ever seriously attempted, to stop adapting to the world and force the world to adapt to us instead. So here we are, the only human species left standing. The descendants of those 280 bottleneck survivors who came within a whisper of extinction 900,000 years ago, the inheritors of Neanderthal cold-weather genes and Denisovan high-altitude adaptations, the species that wasn't the strongest, wasn't the fastest, wasn't even the one with the biggest brain, but somehow we're the ones who inherited the Earth. What made the difference? Looking back across the millennia we've covered tonight, the answer isn't simple. It never is with evolution. But certain patterns emerge from the archaeological record, from the genetic evidence, from the scattered remains of our ancestors and their achievements. First, there was the cognitive revolution, that transformation around 70,000 years ago when something clicked in the modern human brain. Not a sudden mutation, but the culmination of hundreds of thousands of years of selection pressure favouring better communication, more complex planning, enhanced capacity for abstract reasoning. We became the species that could imagine things that didn't exist yet, that could plan hunts for next season's migration, that could tell stories about ancestors we'd never met and places we'd never seen. This mental flexibility, this ability to think beyond the immediate and the concrete, gave us tools no other species possessed. Then there was cooperation. Not just working together, lots of animals do that, but cooperation on a scale that required trust between strangers. Trade networks spanning hundreds of miles, alliances between groups who might never meet face to face, the ability to coordinate the actions of dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of individuals toward common goals. We weren't stronger than Neanderthals in any physical sense, but we could mobilize larger groups more effectively. That made all the difference when resources became scarce or territories overlapped. Language amplified everything else. The ability to convey complex, precise information quickly, to teach intricate skills to the next generation without years of trial and error, to negotiate, to argue, to persuade, to warn. Every innovation in toolmaking could spread across continents within generations instead of millennia. Every survival strategy that worked in one environment could be adapted and applied in another. We became the species whose knowledge accumulated faster than our genes could change. Cultural evolution had overtaken biological evolution as the primary driver of our success. But perhaps most crucial was adaptability, that restless, relentless capacity to adjust when circumstances shifted, the trait that had been hammered into our ancestors during those desperate bottleneck millennia and refined through hundreds of thousands of years in climatically unstable Africa. When we encountered new environments, we didn't just survive them, we figured out how to thrive in them. Frozen tundra, tropical rainforests, high-altitude plateaus, island chains, deserts, we made them, all home. Not through specialized physical adaptations that took millennia to evolve, but through technological and cultural innovations that could be developed in generations. None of this was inevitable. At dozens of points in our history, things could have gone differently. If that volcanic winter 900,000 years ago had lasted just a few decades longer, if the climate hadn't stabilized enough to allow recovery, if Neanderthals had been just slightly more flexible in their survival strategies, if any of 1,000 chance events had fallen differently, we wouldn't be here. Some other species might have inherited the Earth, Or maybe no species would have achieved what we've achieved. The universe doesn't guarantee that intelligence will triumph or that consciousness will spread across worlds. We're not the inevitable endpoint of evolution. We're just the ones who happen to survive. And that brings us to right now, to the present moment, where Homo sapiens has become the most dominant species in Earth's history. We've reshaped entire continents. We've driven thousands of other species to extinction. We've altered the climate and the chemistry of the oceans. We've created technologies our ancestors couldn't have imagined in their most creative moments. We've walked on the moon and sent machines to the edge of the solar system, but dominance comes with responsibility and with risk. The same adaptability that allowed us to thrive in every environment on Earth has given us the power to damage those environments faster than they can recover. The same technological innovation that carried us from stone tools to spacecraft has created weapons capable of destroying civilization. The same population growth that ensured our species would outlast our evolutionary cousins has pushed Earth's ecosystems to their breaking points. We face challenges now that our ancestors never imagined. Climate change happening faster than at any point since the bottleneck. Resources strained by billions of people all wanting better lives. Technologies advancing so rapidly that our social systems struggle to keep pace. The question isn't whether we're clever enough to solve these problems. Clearly we are. The question is whether we'll choose to apply our extraordinary capabilities to solutions rather than to making things worse. The good news? Everything we've covered tonight suggests we can. We're the species that survived when survival seemed impossible. That cooperated when cooperation meant the difference between extinction and recovery. That innovated our way through challenges that destroyed other species, that adapted to every environment Earth could throw at us. Those capabilities haven't disappeared. They're written in our genes, encoded in our cultures, present in every human alive today. Understanding where we came from, really understanding the improbable chain of events and adaptations that brought us to this moment, that's not just interesting history. It's a reminder of what we're capable of when circumstances demand it. Our ancestors faced existential threats with nothing but stone tools and each other. We face our own challenges with technologies and knowledge they couldn't have dreamed of. Before you drift off to sleep tonight, take a moment to appreciate the journey. From those 280 survivors huddled in African refuges to you, lying in bed, listening to the story of your species, hundreds of thousands of years of struggle, innovation, cooperation, and adaptation. Millions of ancestors who survived just long enough to have children, passing forward the genetic and cultural inheritance that made you possible. If you've enjoyed this journey through human history, consider leaving a like on the video. It helps more people discover these stories. Drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you'd like more history content to help you sleep, subscribe and turn on notifications. Sleep well, knowing you're part of the most extraordinary evolutionary success story on Earth. The journey of Homo sapiens isn't over. In many ways, it's just beginning, and whatever comes next, we'll face it with the same capabilities that carried our ancestors through ice ages, volcanic winters, and the near extinction that almost ended our species before it truly began. The story continues, and you're part of it. Sweet dreams.